something I keep returning to. There is a difference between an institution that hides things and an institution that simply never had much reason to surface them. Picture two rooms. In the first, someone is actively moving boxes into the shadows. In the second, the boxes are exactly where they have always been, but no window was ever cut into the wall, and no one was ever given a key. Most of what gets written about the Vatican archive imagines the first room. A locked door, a deliberate secret, something behind the wall. And maybe that is part of the story. But the part that holds my attention is the second room, the one where nothing was moved, nothing was destroyed. And yet certain things have spent centuries in the dark, simply because the institution that owns the room also decides who comes in and when, and what they are allowed to look at. That is what I want to think through here. Not the drama of hidden revelations, but the quieter weight of a structure that has been shaping the historical record for over 12 centuries, without anyone needing to issue an order, destroy a file, or burn a book. Scale and structure of access. Start with the physical reality of what is there. Beneath Vatican City, running through vaulted rooms and long underground corridors, sit approximately 85 kilometers of shelving. Not a figure of speech. If you placed every shelf end to end, you could walk from one city to another before you reached the last document. Along those shelves, documents stretch from the 8th century to the present day. Papal letters, diplomatic correspondence, trial records, maps, account books, private communications, legal decrees. The accumulated paperwork of an institution that has been running without interruption longer than almost any other organization in the Western world. To hold that in mind, most governments that existed in the 8th century are gone. Most empires, cities, and dynasties from that era have dissolved, transformed, or disappeared. The Catholic Church is still here, the same institution, still keeping records. And on those 85 kilometers of shelving, that continuity sits in physical form, folder by folder, century by century. The collection is called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For most of its history, it was known as the Vatican Secret Archive, a name that suggested locked chambers and hidden knowledge, though the Latin word secretum simply meant private, the way a private letter belongs only to its author. Pope Francis changed the name in 2019, hoping to quiet the mythology that had gathered around the old one. The mythology did not entirely quiet. Access works like this. A scholar arrives, not as a tourist, not as a curious visitor, but as an accredited researcher with institutional backing, a formal research proposal, and written approval from the Vatican itself. Once inside, that researcher can examine a limited number of items each day, under supervision, without freely photographing. Documents from any pontificate that ended fewer than 75 years ago remain sealed entirely. The rule is firm. Exceptions exist only when the Pope personally decides to grant them. Imagine a library where the librarian is also the subject of every book, where the same hand that wrote the records also decides who reads them, in what order, and how much time they are allowed. That is the arrangement. It is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to be villainous. It is simply a structure, and the structures without any single person directing them produce their own consequences over time. Before moving forward, it is worth pausing on one more physical detail. The documents inside the archive are not arranged for easy browsing. They are organized by pontificate and administrative category, following the internal logic of a bureaucracy that evolved across many centuries. There is no single open index. A scholar approved for access does not walk in and search freely. they must request specific documents by name, having already determined in advance what they are looking for. To find something unexpected, something misfiled, something that does not appear in any catalog, a researcher must already have some reason to look in the right place, which means the archive's own organizational structure shapes what gets found, quite independently of any deliberate decision about what to reveal. The things most likely to be discovered are the things most likely to have been catalogued. The things least likely to be catalogued are, in some institutional sense, the things that were never meant to be easy to find. How the archive accumulated. From Rome to 1612. The Church did not begin with an archive. It began with people, small communities, traveling letters, debates held in borrowed rooms, arguments written on loose sheets of parchment. The early centuries were fragile. Persecution was periodic and real, and fires destroyed what hands had written. What changed everything was a collapse. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire fell, not in a single battle, but slowly, road by road, city by city, institution by institution. The infrastructure that had kept libraries alive, that had sustained the schools and the scriptoria and the trade routes that carried books between cities, began to unravel. Manuscripts that had existed in stable collections now found themselves in an unstable world. The monasteries filled the gap. Across the ruins of the Roman West, monastic communities became the places where copying continued. A monk bent over a wooden desk, dipping a pen into ink, reproducing a text that might otherwise vanish within a generation. Multiplied across hundreds of monasteries, across centuries, that movement of ink across parchment became the mechanism by which classical learning survived. But the filter was never neutral. The hands doing the copying belonged to men inside a religious institution with specific theological commitments. Some texts survived because a monk found them useful. Some survived because a scriptorium had extra parchment and copied everything in reach. And some faded not because anyone ordered their destruction, but because no one found a reason to copy them again. Century by century, what passed through the filter and what did not was shaped, quietly, without coordination, by the priorities of the people holding the pen. By 1612, when Pope Paul V formally consolidated the Vatican's scattered records into a single centralized archive, what had accumulated was not only the Church's own correspondence, it was the documentation of everything the Church had touched across 1,000 years of European life, the letters of rulers seeking recognition, the records of heresies investigated, the paperwork of communities regulated, the trail of an institution that had been, at various times, the primary administrative authority over an entire civilization. Picture it as a long corridor filling slowly with boxes, 1 century at a time. Each box labeled with a year, a name, a dispute, a petition, a verdict. The corridor grows longer. The boxes multiply. The corridor wasn't only filled with the Church's own story, it was filled with the stories of everyone who had ever had to deal with the Church. And the institution at the far end holds the only key. There is something else in those boxes worth understanding. When the Church absorbed, dissolved, or investigated other institutions and communities, their records often came with them. A monastery dissolved into a larger holding left its documents behind. A community tried for heresy had its beliefs and networks recorded in meticulous detail, and those records became part of the institution's own files. A king who corresponded with Rome for years left copies of that correspondence in Vatican hands, even when the originals stayed in royal collections. The archive, in other words, is not only the Vatican's story, It is a partial record of everyone the Vatican ever dealt with, held now by one of the parties in those encounters, on that party's terms. The Chinon Parchment and the Knights Templar. The most precise illustration of what that arrangement produces sits in a discovery made in 2001 in a section of the archive that had sat undisturbed for a very long time. A researcher named Barbara Friel was working inside the archive when she found a document in the wrong folder, not hidden in a locked room, not buried under false panels, filed incorrectly in a place it did not belong, where it had been sitting for close to 700 years. The document was dated 1308. To understand what it contained, picture the world of the early 14th century. The Knights Templar, a military and financial order founded 2 centuries earlier to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, had grown into one of the most powerful organizations in Christendom. They operated what functioned as an early international banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money in Paris and collect the equivalent value in Jerusalem through a network of Templar houses that stretched across the known world. They held fortresses, land, and capital on a scale that made kings uncomfortable. One king in particular. Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the Templar network and had been looking for a way to resolve that problem. In 1307, he moved. Templar leaders across France were arrested in a coordinated sweep on the same day. They were tortured. Under torture, many confessed to charges that had been circulating as rumors, heresy, the desecration of sacred symbols, obscene rituals. Those confessions became the legal foundation for the order's destruction. The Pope of that moment, Clement V, cooperated. The Templars were formally condemned at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Their Grand Master Jacques de Molay and other senior leaders were burned alive in Paris in 1314. For 700 years after that, the accepted understanding was that the Church had agreed the Templars were guilty, that the Pope had looked at the evidence and acted accordingly. The misfiled document told a different story. It recorded a private papal inquiry held at Chinon Castle in 1308, 1 year after the arrests. 3 cardinals, sent by Clement V himself, had traveled to Chinon and interviewed the Templar leaders. Away from the French inquisitors, away from the cells where the original confessions had been produced, the cardinals listened. Their conclusion: the men were not guilty of heresy. Minor infractions, yes. The serious charges, no. And on the basis of that finding, Clement V privately absolved them. He absolved them in 1308. He allowed them to be burned in 1314. Between those 2 facts sits the gap where the real history lives. The easy reading is personal. A weak pope, a powerful king, a political calculation that cost innocent men their lives. That reading may be partly correct. But the Chinon Parchment reveals something structural beneath the personal. By 1308, the papacy was no longer operating from a position of genuine independence. Clement V was the first pope to reside at Avignon, physically inside French-controlled territory, surrounded by French cardinals, financially dependent on French goodwill. The relationship between Clement V and Philip IV was not between a supreme spiritual authority and a petitioning king. It was between an institution that needed the support of the French crown and the man who held that crown. On one side of a scale, the Pope's private finding that the Templars were innocent. On the other side, the political reality of an institution that could not afford to defy the king it depended on. The scale tipped. The document recording the private finding was misfiled, and it stayed misfiled for 7 centuries. Not because anyone hid it, but because no one was motivated to look for it. That is the subtler point. The Chinon hearing wasn't secret at the time it happened. People knew Clement V had sent his cardinals to Chinon. The inquiry took place. Its results were recorded. The document existed inside the primary repository for papal administrative records. And yet, for 700 years, no historian went looking for it in the right place. A filing system reflects the priorities of the institution that maintains it. What gets cataloged with care, what gets cross-referenced, what gets found. Those outcomes are shaped by what the institution is motivated to surface. The Chinon parchment was not suppressed. It was simply never sought. And that is its own kind of absence. The Index of Forbidden Books and the Logic of Knowledge Control. The archive controlled access from inside, but there was a parallel instrument that worked from the outside, not restricting who could enter a room, but restricting what people were allowed to have read in the first place. In 1440, a new machine appeared in a workshop in Mainz. The printing press changed the movement of knowledge the way a new road changes the movement of people. Texts that had previously existed in dozens of carefully copied manuscripts could now exist in thousands of identical printed copies. Ideas that had lived inside monastery walls and university libraries began moving into the hands of merchants, lawyers, craftsmen, minor clergy, anyone who could read and afford a book. The Church's traditional position, as the institution that copied, interpreted, and distributed written knowledge, was suddenly under pressure from something it had not anticipated and could not control in the way it had controlled manuscripts. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was the formal response. Established in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, it was a list. A list of publications that Catholics were prohibited from reading, printing, owning, or distributing. The penalty was excommunication, removal from the community of the faithful. Over 4 centuries, the list grew to contain more than 4,000 titles. Lay the list on a table and look at what is on it. Galileo's astronomical work, Machiavelli's analysis of political power, Erasmus's humanist scholarship, Descartes's philosophical method, the system of careful doubt that helped found modern thinking, Edward Gibbon's History of Rome, which examined early Christianity the way a historian examines any historical phenomenon, as something that happened, that had causes, that can be studied. And, at various points, the Bible itself, in translations that would let ordinary people read it in their own language without the mediation of a trained cleric. That restriction held, in some form, until the 18th century. These were not obscure texts. Most of them were already circulating among educated Europeans when they were added to the list. Banning Machiavelli did not remove him from the shelves of people who had already read him. So what was the list actually doing? It was drawing a boundary, not around the texts, but around the readers. On one side, knowledge that the Church sanctioned, that was safe to hold, that marked you as a member in good standing. On the other side, a category of thought that placed you, formally and officially, outside the community the Church defined and governed. The Index turned the question of what you had read into a question of who you were. That is a specific and durable kind of authority. It doesn't require destroying knowledge. It requires making certain kinds of knowledge into markers of identity, of belonging or not belonging. Whether or not a book was actually suppressed, the act of listing it reshaped the intellectual landscape around it, redirecting attention, pulling scholars toward safer ground, creating a quiet gravity around the edges of sanctioned thought. The Index was abolished in 1966, following the Second Vatican Council. the mechanism disappeared. But the underlying premise, that the institution has legitimate authority over what people are ready to know, and when, and in what context, did not end with the list. It simply became invisible, no longer attached to a document anyone could point to and argue with. The archive expresses the same premise through a different mechanism. Not a list of forbidden books, but a set of access conditions enforced by institutional sovereignty. The logic connecting them is the same. One said, "These books are outside the boundary we draw." The other says, "This collection is inside the boundary we draw, and you may enter only on our terms." Think about what 4 centuries of the Index actually produced in terms of intellectual atmosphere. By the time it was abolished, educated Catholics had lived for 16 generations in a framework where certain books and certain kinds of inquiry carried a formal institutional designation as dangerous. That designation was not always enforced uniformly. But it existed. It shaped what teachers assigned, what scholars cited, what publishers risked, what libraries prominently displayed. It created a kind of institutional gravity around certain intellectual territories, pulling scholarly attention towards safer ground without requiring anyone to issue an explicit prohibition in any given moment. When the list ended, that gravitational field did not switch off. Intellectual cultures do not reorganize overnight because a formal rule changes. The habits of thought that had formed around the list, the tendency to sense a boundary in certain directions, to feel that certain modes of inquiry existed at the edge of the acceptable, those habits were considerably slower to change than the rule that had shaped them. The premise survived the mechanism. It simply became less visible. The Inquisition as an information-gathering system. There is a dimension of the Inquisition that tends to disappear in the way it is usually discussed, treated almost entirely as a story of persecution, of trials and executions, and the suppression of dissent. Persecution was certainly part of what it was, but the Inquisition was also, in a very practical sense, one of the most systematic information-gathering operations in European history. Picture a tribunal room somewhere in 15th century Spain. A scribe sits at a table to one side, quill moving steadily across parchment. Questions are asked. Answers are recorded. Names of associates are written down. Descriptions of beliefs, rituals, and networks are documented in careful detail. At the end of the session, the pages are filed. Multiplied across decades, across hundreds of tribunals, across 2 countries, and a vast colonial empire, this process produced archives that historians now regard as among the most comprehensive records of ordinary life and popular belief in early modern Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, which operated from 1478 to 1834, left behind documentation that has proven invaluable for understanding how ordinary people lived, thought, and spoke, what they believed in private, who they trusted, what they feared. Those records were not created to serve historians. They were created to serve the institution. They tracked individuals across years, allowing future investigators to check whether someone had been questioned before. They mapped social networks. They identified patterns of belief that might indicate organized resistance. The archive was an operational tool, a database that made the institution's control more effective and more precise. Think about what that means. The Church spent several centuries building, at considerable expense, a sophisticated system for extracting detailed information from ordinary people, often under duress, sometimes under explicit threat of violence, and then retaining that information in restricted institutional collections. The same institution that extracted the information now decides who can see it, under what conditions, and for how long. In recent decades, descendants of people tried by the Spanish Inquisition have sought access to those records. The results have been partial. Parts of the Roman Inquisition's archives were opened to researchers in 1998 under Pope John Paul II, another carefully framed opening presented in the language of institutional transparency. Parts remain restricted. And the question of who has the right to access a record of their ancestors' persecution, held by the institution that carried out the persecution, is not one the current governance structure answers cleanly. Napoleon and the imperfection of the archive. In 1810, Napoleon did something no one had done before in the archive's history, and no one has done since. He ordered the entire collection transferred to Paris. The reasoning was Napoleonic in scale. He intended to make Paris the administrative capital of a unified Europe, and he wanted the central institutional records of Western Christendom consolidated there. The transfer was enormous. More than 3,000 cases of documents were packed, loaded onto wagons, and hauled across the Alps over several years. For roughly 7 years, the entire accumulated record of the papacy sat in Paris. Then Napoleon fell. The French Empire collapsed in a matter of months, and the question of what to do with the archive became suddenly urgent. The return was not orderly. Documents were repacked without the care that had attended the original transfer. Some were damaged in transit. Some were misfiled in French institutions and never came back. Some pages from manuscripts were sold during the chaos, purchased as curiosities by collectors, permanently separated from the larger works they had been part of. Some documents simply vanished in the general disorder. The Vatican received back most of what had been sent, not all of it, and the portion that returned arrived in a condition that reflected the disruption of the journey. Scholars today estimate that a meaningful part of the collection from before the Napoleonic period exists in fragmentary or imperfect condition as a result. Picture what that means concretely. Individual pages detached from the manuscripts they belonged to. Documents filed in the wrong century. Items that arrived back in Paris in crates but never made the return journey, absorbed into French institutional collections or purchased by private collectors who had no idea what they held. The 85 kilometers of shelving is not a sealed, complete record. It is a historical artifact, carrying within it the damage of fire, flood, the sack of Rome in 1527, the displacement of the Avignon papacy, and an imperial confiscation that was never quite fully reversed. What this reveals is something important to hold before reaching for grand conclusions about the archive. The collection is not a sealed, perfectly preserved, comprehensively organized vault of historical knowledge. Some of its silences are chosen. Others are simply the result of time and disruption, operating on physical objects in an imperfect world. The Napoleon episode also shaped something else. It is the only moment in the archive's history when the collection was removed from church control and made available to outside eyes on terms the church did not set, and it happened because an emperor took it by force. The institutional memory of that experience almost certainly reinforced what the church already understood, that the archive's integrity depended on keeping the institution's sovereign control over it absolute. That lesson has shaped archival policy in a direct line from 1815 to the present. Leo XIII, 1881, and the template of transparency. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII opened the Vatican archive to external researchers for the first time in its formal history. A lamp was lit at the door. Scholars could come in, but the circumstances around that lamp are worth understanding clearly. The Papal States had been dissolved 10 years earlier, absorbed into the newly unified Italian state. The papacy was operating from Vatican City, a small enclave without formal sovereign recognition, in a posture of grievance toward the Italian government that surrounded it. And the historical scholarship being produced in Protestant Germany, Britain, and elsewhere had not been kind to the medieval church. Historians were reading the past in ways the church found distorting and frequently unfair. Leo XIII's decision to open the archive was, in significant part, a strategic response. His reasoning: bring the scholars in, let them see the record, let the evidence speak for itself. The assumption was that the evidence would support, rather than undermine, the Church's own account of its history. The archivist overseeing the opening was given instructions that reflected this framing. Access would be calibrated. The priority was not comprehensive disclosure, but the management of a specific problem: the Church's reputation in a scholarly world that had been producing unfavorable accounts. The archive was being opened not as a service to history, but as a tool of demonstration. What actually happened was more complicated than Leo XIII had probably expected. The documents did produce corrections, but not all of them favored the Church. The Galileo trial records became available to serious scholarly study for the first time. Researchers found material that complicated the tidy narratives on both sides of various historical debates. The archive, once open even partially, began generating scholarship that the institution could not fully direct. But the template established in 1881 has persisted. Each subsequent opening, the Galileo records, the Inquisition archives, the Pius XII papers, has followed the same shape. External pressure builds over years or decades. Scholars write letters, publish arguments, lobby through diplomatic and academic channels. And then the Pope makes a decision, and the decision is framed in official statements, in press releases, in the language of the Church, as an act of the Church's own initiative, its own willingness, its own confidence in the record. Consider what that framing does. It repositions the institution relative to the information it releases. An institution that responds to sustained external pressure by finally opening a door is in a different position from one that simply chose to open it on its own terms. The first relationship involves accountability. The second involves generosity. By consistently presenting each opening as generosity, as the Church's own confident initiative, the framing forecloses a different set of questions before they can be asked. What took so long? Who decided this particular year was acceptable and the decade before was not? And what else remains on the shelf? Those questions are not sensational. They are the ordinary questions that any external accountability mechanism would raise, and the archive's governance structure ensures that no external accountability mechanism exists to raise them. Information released as a gift tends to be received with gratitude and accepted as complete. Information released as a response to a claim that has been deferred for decades invites a different kind of attention, not gratitude, but the natural follow-up. What else is there, and why was this particular year acceptable when the previous decade was not? The framing of each opening as institutional initiative forecloses those questions before they form. And because the institution controls both the decision and the language surrounding it, the framing is always its own. This is not unique to the Vatican. Every institution manages the narrative around its own historical disclosures. What is unusual about the Vatican is the scale, the duration, and the absence of any mechanism that might produce a different kind of accountability. Most institutions eventually face external pressure that shapes how and when they release records. the Vatican faces only the pressure it cannot indefinitely resist, which is, in practice, the pressure that has been building longest and has become impossible to defer without greater cost than disclosure. The timing of each opening reflects that calculus, not a principled commitment to transparency as a value. Galileo and the culture surrounding the archive. The Galileo case has been retold so many times that familiarity can feel like understanding, when in fact the most instructive detail is one that almost never gets mentioned. Galileo Galilei spent his life arguing for something we now know to be true. The earth moves around the sun. He was a devout Catholic who believed the physical evidence and the correct interpretation of Scripture pointed in the same direction, that the Church, given time and careful argument, would come to see it. He was wrong about the Church's willingness to look. In 1633, he was tried by the Inquisition, found vehemently suspected of heresy, required to formally recant, and sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. His major work was placed on the Index. In 1992, 359 years later, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had been wrong. The acknowledgement came after a 13-year papal commission convened specifically to address the question. The trial records have been available to scholars, and they reveal something more nuanced than the simplified version of either side. The charge was technically framed as discipline rather than pure doctrinal condemnation, and Galileo was not physically tortured. These are genuine corrections to some popular accounts. They do not change the underlying fact. The Church suppressed a correct scientific understanding of the solar system using the full weight of its institutional authority, and maintained that position for 3.5 centuries. But here is the detail that stayed with me. Bishop Sergio Pagano spent decades as the prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, the person most directly responsible for the care and management of the entire collection. In an interview published in a book called Secretum, Pagano described a visit he received from a cardinal early in his tenure. The cardinal invited him aside and said plainly, "If you find anything in the Galileo documents that could harm the Church, destroy it." Pagano says he destroyed nothing. There is no reason to doubt him. But the instruction itself, offered conversationally, as though it were a reasonable professional suggestion, is what stays. This was not a whispered conspiracy. This was a senior member of the Church hierarchy speaking to the institution's chief archivist about his responsibilities. It was offered as though it were a normal thing to say. A room where the person in charge of the documents is told, informally, that one of his jobs is to watch for things that might be harmful, and to make them disappear, is not simply a storage facility. It is a managed environment. The instruction may have gone unheeded in this case, but the fact that it was given tells us something about the culture that surrounded the archive for most of its history. The expectation that the person holding the key was also, in some sense, a guardian of what the key would reveal. Pius XII, the Holocaust, and the mechanism of selection. The most recent major opening of the archive, and the one that most clearly shows what managed historical disclosure looks like in practice, concerns the papacy of Pius XII during the Second World War. Pius XII led the Church from 1939 to 1958. He was pope throughout the Holocaust, throughout the years when 6 million Jewish people were systematically murdered across occupied Europe. Throughout those years, he said remarkably little in public. He did not formally condemn the deportations. He did not publicly name what was being done. His silence became, over the following decades, one of the most contested questions in 20th century religious and ethical history. The documents that might have helped explain that silence sat in the Vatican archive. For decades, historians, survivors' organizations, and Jewish community leaders requested access. The Vatican maintained the 75-year rule. Pope Francis opened the papers in March 2020, 77 years after the events at their center. What the documents show is genuinely complicated, and the honest account holds both sides. Pius XII received detailed reports of what was happening to Jewish populations across Europe from Catholic clergy with direct knowledge of Nazi operations. But those same sources explicitly asked him not to speak publicly, warning that a formal condemnation from Rome would give the Nazi regime a pretext for intensified violence against Catholics and against the Jewish people the Church was quietly helping to shelter. The Vatican did arrange protection for thousands of Jewish people through unofficial channels, churches, monasteries, convents, Vatican City itself. These are documented facts, and they matter. But the released documents also contain something that sits on the other side of the ledger. A memo from a Vatican advisor, Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua, written in response to reports of mass killings. The memo argued against lodging any formal protest. Its stated reasoning: Jewish communities tend to exaggerate what is being done to them. That memo was written in response to documentation of the Holocaust, and it was deliberately excluded from the 11-volume official collection of Vatican documents that the Holy See published between 1965 and 1981, a collection specifically compiled to address questions about the Church's wartime conduct and to make the case for Pius XII's record. Stand the two things next to each other. On one side, 11 carefully compiled volumes of documentation released to the world as the full Vatican account of the wartime years. On the other side, a memo that directly complicated that account, sitting on a shelf in the archive, not included. Not lost, not overlooked. Left out. The Vatican did not falsify its 11 volumes. The documents included were real documents, but it selected which real documents appeared, and the selection consistently excluded the ones that complicated the case it was making. That distinction matters enormously, because selection is far harder to detect than falsification. Place a falsified document next to the truth, and eventually the contradiction becomes visible. A date that does not match, a signature that does not fit, a detail that conflicts with evidence from another source. Forgery creates a seam. A missing document creates nothing, no seam, no contradiction, no anomaly. The visible record is internally consistent. It simply stops at a certain point, and the stopping is invisible because there is nothing to point to. The space where the missing document should be is occupied by silence, and silence looks the same whether it is intentional or accidental. The only way to know the Dell'Acqua memo existed was to have access to the complete archive. The only way to know what the memo said was to read it inside the archive, under supervision, within the limits of the approved research plan. The only way to know it had been excluded from the 11 published volumes was to have access to both, the published volumes and the complete archive, and to compare what was in one against what was missing from the other. Each of those steps required access the institution controlled. The exposure of the exclusion required the institution to open the archive in the first place. Without the 2020 opening, the memo would still be on the shelf, and the 11 volumes would still be the full Vatican account of those years. This is the most refined version of the problem the archive presents. Not a locked room with something behind it. An open room, carefully curated, containing real evidence, produced by serious people, in which certain documents are simply absent. And the structure that determines what is absent is the same structure that decides when and whether the absence is ever corrected. The Vatican as a sovereign state, without external accountability. To understand why the archive's governance structure is unusual, compare it to how historical accountability works in other contexts. A government that seals its records too long faces freedom of information litigation, parliamentary oversight, investigative journalism that finds other routes to the same material. A corporation that manages its records in ways that harm people faces regulatory investigations and civil litigation. A university that suppresses inconvenient research faces peer review and the pressures of academic freedom frameworks. These mechanisms are imperfect, slow, often resisted, sometimes failed. But they exist. They create friction. Over time, that friction pushes towards disclosure. Now consider the Vatican. The archive belongs to the Pope as sovereign. Access is granted at papal discretion. No court can compel disclosure. No freedom of information law applies. The Holy See is diplomatically recognized by nearly every country on Earth, which means it operates under the protections of sovereign status, a status that places the archive outside the reach of the legal mechanisms that govern other institutions' relationship to their historical records. In place of legal accountability, the Vatican faces scholarly reputation, moral argument, and the accumulated pressure of communities who feel they have claims on the record. Those pressures are real. They have produced real openings. But they operate on a timeline calibrated entirely by the institution's own judgment about when the cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of disclosure. And that judgment is made by the institution itself, in its own interest, with the full knowledge that no external mechanism will force its hand if it decides to wait. This is not a cover story invented to protect secrets. It is a genuinely held theological premise, centuries old, that the Pope's authority derives from a source that human institutions cannot audit. That premise is internally coherent. Its consequence, in practice, is that the institution which has held the most complete record of a significant portion of Western civilization's history governs that record entirely on its own terms. Think of what that means as a diagram. On one side, an institution with 85 kilometers of shelving, centuries of accumulated documentation, and no legally enforceable obligation to open any of it. On the other side, historians, scholars, communities with claims on that record, able to write letters and publish arguments and wait. The two sides are not in balance. They have never been in balance. The openings that have happened are real, but each one required the institution on the first side to decide that the moment had arrived, not the scholars, not the communities, the institution. The knowledge that emerges from that arrangement is real knowledge. The scholars who work within it are serious professionals doing important historical work. But the knowledge is also filtered by the timing of openings, the framing of releases, the management of what remains on the shelf. Filtered knowledge, received as though it were complete, produces a particular kind of misunderstanding, one that is confident, well-sourced, and yet systematically shaped by an institutional hand that is very difficult to see from the outside. Consider the specific shape of that filtering over the archive's history. In 1881, scholars gained access, but only to materials the Church had decided were safe to release, on a timeline the Church controlled, presented in a framing the Church chose. In 1998, the Roman Inquisition archives were partially opened, partially. In 2020, the Pius XII papers were released, and a memo that directly contradicted the Church's own published account of those years was found inside. Each opening was genuine. Each opening was also, in its own way, managed. This does not mean every person inside the institution is trying to hide the past. Most of the archivists, scholars, and priests who work with these documents are doing careful, serious, honorable work. But when one institution controls the record for a long enough time, its priorities naturally shape what survives into public view, not through malice, but through the ordinary operation of a structure that places the decision in one place and one place only. The honest counter-argument: what the archive has genuinely contributed. The picture I have been building leans in a specific direction. It deserves to be held against its own strongest objection. The Vatican Archive, for all the structural problems its governance presents, has also been the site of genuine historical discovery. The Chinon parchment changed the historical understanding of the Templar dissolution. The Galileo records allowed scholars to examine one of the most famous episodes in the history of science with a depth of primary source detail that had not been possible before the archive opened. The Inquisition archives, in the portions that have been made accessible, have given historians some of the most comprehensive pictures available of ordinary life and popular belief in early modern Europe. The Pius XII papers, complicated as their implications are now out in the world and being studied. These are genuine contributions, and they come from an institution that could, in principle, have kept all of it sealed indefinitely and did not. On a table, place what has been released beside what the archive contains. The released portion is real, studied, and significant. The unreleased portion is still on those 85 kilometers of shelving, accessible only on the institution's terms, according to the institution's judgment about when the time is right. The question is not whether the archive has produced historical understanding. Clearly, it has. The question is whether the historical understanding it has produced is proportional to what it holds, and whether the conditions under which that understanding is generated would satisfy any external observer as adequate. On those questions, the answer becomes considerably less comfortable. Think of it as two columns on a ledger. In the first column, the Chinon parchment, the Galileo records, the partial Inquisition archives, the Pius XII papers. Genuine discoveries, genuinely significant, produced by serious scholars doing careful work. In the second column, everything on those 85 kilometers of shelving that has not yet been opened, organized by the institution's own priorities, released on the institution's own timeline, framed in the institution's own language. The first column is real. The second column is still on the shelf. And the institution that controls the second column is also the institution that determines when and whether anything moves from the second column into the first. What remains sealed and the 75-year rule. Among the things currently sealed in the Vatican Archive, two categories represent the most consequential gaps in the present historical record. The first, the full documentation of the Church's relationships with 20th century political regimes. The Pius XII papers have been opened, but the papacy's correspondence is only one thread of a much larger institutional engagement. The Jesuit order maintained its own extensive records of the Church's relationships with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, records that are not fully accessible. The Vicariate of Rome, which would document the local church's conduct during the Nazi occupation of the city, a period when more than 1,000 Roman Jews were deported from streets just outside Vatican walls, remains largely closed. These are not questions from a distant era. They concern events within living memory, affecting communities whose members are still alive, whose children and grandchildren are still seeking to understand what happened to their families and why. The second, the complete records of pontificates from the mid-20th century that have not yet crossed the 75-year threshold. Pope John XXIII, who convened the Second Vatican Council, one of the most significant internal reforms in the modern Church's history, remains sealed. Pope Paul VI, who oversaw the implementation of those reforms and some of the most consequential internal debates in modern Catholic life, remains sealed. Pope John Paul I, whose papacy lasted 33 days before he was found dead in his bedroom, with no independent autopsy ever conducted, remains sealed. The absence of a full public record has fueled decades of speculation that the Vatican has done little to concretely address. Consider the 75-year rule as a structural choice rather than a neutral administrative policy. What it consistently produces is this: the most sensitive documents from any given pontificate are withheld until the generation of people who lived through those events is mostly gone, until the scholars who devoted their careers to those periods have mostly aged out of active research, until the political and institutional stakes of the revelations have been significantly reduced by time. A document that might have been explosive in 1975 is considerably less so in 2025. The rule reliably ensures that the archive's disclosures happen at the pace most favorable to the institution, which is, consistently, after the people most directly affected have the least capacity to respond. That is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of a governance system built to prioritize institutional interests. And recognizing it as structural rather than conspiratorial is the more analytically honest position. Because structures persist even when the people operating within them have entirely good intentions, while conspiracies require ongoing coordination. The 75-year rule does not require anyone to be malicious. It only requires the structure to keep functioning as designed. Picture the rule on a timeline. A pope's reign ends. A clock starts. 75 years pass. The historians most invested in that period, the ones who spent their careers studying it, who had the deepest contextual knowledge, who understood best what questions to ask, have mostly aged out of active research. The communities most directly affected, the people who lived through those events, who have the most urgent reasons to want clarity, have grown old or are gone. What remains is a historical question that still matters, but whose urgency has been absorbed by time. The documents then open into a world that has already formed its understanding without them. Textbooks have been written. Documentaries have been produced. Public understanding has calcified around whatever picture could be assembled from the material that was available. The documents that emerge must now travel against all of that. The correction is possible, but slow. The understanding it corrects is already deeply embedded. The 75-year rule doesn't need to be designed with bad intentions to produce that outcome. It only needs to exist. And it has existed consistently across many pontificates, applied in ways that reliably ensure the most sensitive disclosures arrive after the people most equipped and most motivated to act on them have the least capacity to do so. The rule also does something to the character of the disclosure itself. A document released 75 years after the events it describes enters a different world than the one it left. The political context has shifted. The institutional stakes have changed. The people who might have been most damaged by the revelations, or most empowered by them, are gone. What arrives is historical knowledge in the academic sense, important, studied, absorbed into scholarly debate. But it no longer carries the urgency it would have carried when it was first written. It has been laundered by time into something more comfortable for the institution to release. The larger question: institutional time and the compounding of absence. There is a question the archive raises that goes further than the archive itself, and I want to try to reach it before we finish. Institutions operate on timescales that individual human lives cannot span. A scholar who spent 40 years becoming a leading expert on the dissolution of the Knights Templar, who read every available source, trained students, wrote books that shaped the field, did all of that work with an incomplete record. Not because they were careless, because the document that would have changed their understanding was sitting in a misfiled folder in a building they were not fully permitted to enter. A lifetime of work, shaped not by the limits of intelligence or diligence, but by the governance structure of an archive. That influence is quiet. It leaves no mark on the scholarship it shapes. A room full of historians working from the available record doesn't know what the available record is missing. The gaps do not announce themselves. The understanding that forms around those gaps moves through the scholarly literature looking complete, because from inside the available record, it is complete. Historical scholarship is a cumulative enterprise. Scholars build on the work of scholars who came before. They inherit not only the findings of previous research, but the questions that research left open, the assumptions it treated as settled, the frameworks within which it understood the evidence. When the evidence itself is shaped by institutional access decisions, when some documents are on the shelf and others are not, and the line between them is drawn by the institution whose record is at stake, those institutional decisions become embedded in the scholarly framework. They become part of what counts as established knowledge. Think about what that means over generations. A document withheld in 1881 is missing not only from the scholarship of 1881, it is missing from the scholarship of 1920, which built on 1881, missing from the scholarship of 1960, which built on 1920. It shapes the framework of assumptions that scholars in 2001 inherit before anyone has found the misfiled folder. The governance decision echoes forward, silently, invisibly, through every generation of scholarship that follows it. The Chinon Parchment corrected a 700-year misunderstanding. That correction is real and important. But think about the weight of 700 years of scholarship shaped by the absence of that document. The courses taught, the books written, the students trained, the popular accounts published, the cultural understanding formed around an incomplete picture. When the correction arrived, it had to travel against all of that accumulated understanding. It is still traveling against it. Most people who know anything about the Knights Templar learned what they know from a tradition that did not have the Chinon parchment. The correction exists. The misunderstanding it corrects is considerably more deeply embedded. That asymmetry between how deeply an incomplete understanding embeds itself over centuries and how quickly a correction can travel once it finally appears is the real cost of the governance structure. Not any single document, not any single decision. The compounding effect, across time, of institutional control over what enters the record and when. Picture a timeline on a wall. Along the top, the years run forward from the 13th century to the present. Below each year, a small mark appears every time a historian publishes a work on the Knights Templar, building on the work before it, citing sources that cited sources, inheriting questions and assumptions from predecessors they never met. For 700 years, every single one of those marks was placed without the knowledge that the Chinon parchment existed. The timeline looks complete. It looks like a record of advancing knowledge. But it is a record of advancing knowledge built on a missing foundation. When the parchment was found in 2001, the correction did not travel backward and update all those marks. It entered the world at one point in the timeline and had to make its way forward from there, fighting the resistance of everything already written, already taught, already embedded in what students and journalists and documentary makers had learned to take as established. The correction is real. The structure it is correcting is considerably more deeply rooted. When Pope Francis opened the Pius XII papers in 2020, he said, "The Church is not afraid of history." It is a sentence that has been used in various forms by multiple popes at multiple openings across the past century. It is designed to signal confidence and openness, but read it carefully. The Church is not afraid of history. Not, "Here is the record. Study it on your own terms. Hold us accountable." But we are not afraid. We are choosing to show you this. The confidence is the institution's confidence in its own capacity to manage the disclosure. The reassurance is offered on the institution's terms, at the moment the institution chose. Place those two statements side by side. The one about not being afraid, and the one about choosing to show. Between them sits the precise definition of the arrangement. The door exists. The institution holds it. It opens when the institution decides, not when historians determine the need, not when affected communities claim their right, not when any external standard of transparency requires it. When the institution decides. That sentence, repeated at every major opening, is perhaps the clearest single expression of the relationship between the Vatican Archive and historical transparency. Not a closed door, not an open one. A door the institution holds, opening it when it judges the time is right, framing each opening as an act of confidence rather than a response to any legitimate external claim. The archive's governance structure doesn't only shape what historians know, it shapes what historians think is worth asking. Research questions form in response to available material. When certain material is systematically unavailable, the discipline reorganizes itself around what it can study, develops frameworks suited to what it can access, builds careers on questions those sources can address. Over generations, the discipline comes to reflect the shape of the available record, not as a deliberate adaptation, but as the ordinary result of people working with what they have. The absence becomes invisible because the discipline has grown accustomed to the shape of the available territory and stopped noticing what lies outside it. Think of it as a room where the furniture has been arranged around a space in the center. Everyone who enters learns to walk around that space without thinking about it. New furniture gets arranged to fit the existing pattern. Eventually, no one remembers there was ever anything in the center because the room has been organized for so long around its absence. When materials do surface, when a misfiled document is found, or a sealed section finally opens, the corrections do not only update a specific historical question. They reveal that the frameworks built around the absence were themselves partial, that the questions scholars had learned to ask were shaped by what they could ask, which was shaped by what was available, which was shaped by institutional governance decisions made for institutional reasons. The Chinon parchment did not only correct the historical verdict on the Templars, it revealed that the entire framing of the question, how to understand the relationship between papal authority and secular political power in the early 14th century, had been shaped by a partial record. The correction is local. The implications reach further. There is one more layer worth naming before we finish, because it addresses something that tends to be felt in conversations about the archive without being quite articulated. When people talk about what the Vatican archive might contain, the imagination tends toward the dramatic. Documents that would overturn established history, revelations that would require major revisions to what we thought we knew. That imagining is understandable. But the more consequential form of what the archive holds is probably not dramatic at all. It is probably ordinary. Account books, internal correspondence, minutes of meetings. The kind of material that, when you finally gain access to it, turns out to be less revelatory than the long wait suggested. The most significant effect of the archive's governance structure is not that it might be concealing some explosive revelation. It is that it has shaped, continuously and without announcing itself, the baseline of what counts as established historical knowledge across 12 centuries of scholarship. Every generation of historians who worked without access to certain documents produced work shaped by that absence. Work that became the foundation for the next generation, which became the foundation for the generation after that. Small tilts, repeated consistently over long periods, accumulate into something that looks very much like the settled record. This is why the question of who governs the archive matters more than the question of what any particular document might say. The governance shapes the record over time. The individual documents are almost secondary to the structure that determines which of them get to travel and which remain on the shelf. And that structure, 85 kilometers of shelving, one institution, one door, one hand holding the key, has been in place for more than 12 centuries. The question of whether that is an adequate arrangement for knowledge of that importance is not a sensational question. It is simply an honest one. If you have followed this through to the end, I am glad you stayed. The subject does not resolve the way a locked door mystery resolves, with a room revealed, a secret disclosed, a single hidden truth finally shown. What the Vatican archive presents is something quieter and, I think, more genuinely interesting than that. It is a structure that has been producing specific kinds of knowledge and specific kinds of absence for more than 12 centuries. The structure does not require villains. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only that an institution holding the record also sets the terms of access, and that this arrangement, sustained over long enough a time, shapes what the world knows and doesn't know about the past. The most useful thing to carry from this is not a conclusion about the Vatican specifically. It is a way of thinking about where historical knowledge comes from. We receive the past through institutions that held the record of it. Those institutions were never neutral. Their choices about what to preserve, what to open, what to frame as transparency, and what to leave in the wrong folder. Those choices are part of history too, even when they are invisible. The people who work in and around the Vatican archive, the archivists, the scholars, the historians who have spent careers with this material, are not, for the most part, engaged in any effort to deceive. They are working within a structure that was built with specific institutional interests embedded in it, and that produces specific patterns of disclosure and withholding, without anyone needing to intend those patterns at any individual moment. A monk in a medieval scriptorium copying a text that would otherwise vanish was not making a decision about historical suppression. He was doing his job within the priorities his institution had given him. A cardinal who casually advised an archivist to destroy anything harmful to the church was not thinking of himself as a conspirator. He was doing what the culture of the institution had made seem reasonable. An institution that compiles 11 volumes of wartime documentation and excludes a memo that complicates the account is not producing a lie. It is making a selection, as institutions always do, shaped by the interests that govern what the selection is meant to demonstrate. The pattern that emerges from all of this, from the misfiled document that sat in the wrong folder for 7 centuries, from the index that shaped intellectual culture for 4, from the Inquisition records held by the institution that produced them, from the 75-year rule that ensures disclosures arrive after the most affected communities have the least ability to respond, is not the pattern of deliberate concealment. It is the pattern of a structure that has been optimizing, continuously and without announcing it, for the interests of the institution that controls it. Understanding the difference between the intentions of individuals and the effects of structures is, I think, what makes this subject genuinely illuminating rather than simply troubling. It is not about good people or bad people. It is about what happens when the same body holds both the record and the keys. The door at the end of those 85 kilometers of shelving is still only partly open. That is worth knowing. And if you find yourself thinking about what lies on the other side, and why the door opens at the pace it does, I would be glad to keep exploring these questions with you. The Vatican Archive is not a simple story. It is not a story of villains holding forbidden knowledge against a helpless world. It is something more ordinary, and in its ordinariness, more durable. A structure that has been doing what structures do, producing outcomes shaped by the interests embedded in them, for longer than most structures in the world have existed. That is what makes it worth thinking about carefully, not the locked rooms, the arrangement itself. And that arrangement asks a question that extends well beyond the Vatican. Every institution that holds a historical record makes decisions, continuously, mostly without announcing them, about what to surface and what to leave undisturbed. The Vatican Archive makes those decisions visible at a scale and duration that has no real parallel. Sitting with that visibility, calmly, honestly, without reaching for drama or settling for reassurance, is where the real understanding begins. And real understanding, even when it is incomplete, is always worth the time it takes to arrive. The questions the archive raises are not sensational. They are simply honest. And honest questions, asked carefully, are worth more than dramatic answers. That is as true of the Vatican Archive as it is of any institution that has ever held the record of the world we are still trying to understand. The archive does not need to contain a single dramatic revelation to be worth thinking about carefully. The structure itself is the story.